Good evening. This video on to a second part dealing with Robert Breaker's attempt again to defend the Confederacy, the evil of the Confederacy. One thing you notice, he can't distinguish between a Confederate and the Confederacy. And I made a video before that I was uploading. I was too hot. I was too hot. So I deleted it. At best, I said, hey, you gotta calm down. This guy, he's lies. He calls Lincoln a despot, a tyrant. That's what these guys think. He tries to make the ideas that Southern secession was legal, which wasn't. Nowhere in the Constitution does allow secession. You think Oregon can secede from the Union today? That's a legal right. Never was a legal right. He has a simplified aspect of the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists. That was the issue of individual rights. Both sides of individual rights. The idea was how they best defend them. The states were violating individual rights under the Articles of Confederation that existed then. That's why a more perfect union was needed, a stronger central government. But both sides are trying to defend the individual rights. The issue is the balance. The federal system is a balance. Federalism is a balance between levels of government, local, state, and federal. All exist to protect the individual rights. It was the South that began, by the way, the gun control laws, and Jim Crow laws, suppressing the black vote. And he wants to accuse, and he accuses Grant of being drunk every night. What a liar. Grant had a drinking problem when he was out of the Army. He was not drunk while he was serving. That was an attack on him. And you think the guy who drank every night was going to be able to defeat Lee? I don't think so. The issue goes back to Andrew Jackson, Calhoun, nullification argument. By 18th nullification argument, John Calhoun said he didn't like the tariff issue. Andrew Jackson, a Southerner, Tennessee, when they said, "Oh, South Carolina said we're going to nullify that law," South Carolina said, Jackson said that would be a revolution, a revolt, and he'd hang Calhoun for it. No one had this idea you could secede. Then they tried to push the idea of secession after that. There's no right to secede. There was. It's not even in the Confederate Constitution. The only state that recognized the Confederacy was the Vatican, because they wanted to divide the United States. They wanted to divide the United States. Then he talks about Lee holding out until if Lincoln, had been assassinated. I think he was assassinated 6 days later. No one changed anything. The war was over. The war was over. He makes the comment in there talking about now there were blacks who with their slave owners up in the front lines, helping the blacks, helping the Confederates, and sometimes they would shoot back at the Union Army. But they didn't get official weapon, official part of the army until 1864. Here you go. In this book here, the Black, Blue, and Gray by African Americans in the Civil War by Jim Haskins. Haskins. He said here, at almost the same time, another extraordinary thing happened. Confederate General Robert E. Lee asked Confederate President Jefferson Davis to be allowed to recruit slaves into the Confederate Army with the promise of freedom for themselves and their families as payment. Confederate military officials had considered the idea seriously since early 1864. Now again, it doesn't mean the blacks weren't in the front line with their masters, but they weren't part of the army. See, Breaker said they were half the army. They weren't half the army. Now in the North, they took a great proportion of the army of the North. They became a great proportion of the North, and they were very poorly treated by the Northerners as well. This book makes it very clear that, despite fighting very violently. And they had two issues there. The Confederates did not take prisoners with the blacks. Or if they did take prisoners, they sent them into slavery. They treated them much worse than the whites. and the black soldier always had to recognize that. Those are facts. Robert can make anything up he wants. The huge losses the Confederacy had suffered in the course of the war had begun to tell on General Lee and troops. On January 2nd, a group of Confederate officers headed by Major General Patrick Claiborne offered a report to their commanding officer. It stated that slavery, once the chief source of Confederate strength, was now one of our chief sources of weaknesses. It proposed that we immediately commence training a large reserve of the most courageous of our slaves, and further we guarantee freedom within a reasonable time for every slave in the South who shall remain true to the Confederacy in this war. President Jefferson Davis refused to even consider the proposal and forbade further discussion of the matter in the Confederate Army. But the idea would not die. As time went on, the human, natural, and manufacturing resources of the Confederate States continued to be depleted. More and more people accepted the notion of arming slaves. Indeed, by the fall of 1864, after rebel defeats in Georgia, Alabama, and Virginia, arming the slaves seemed the only way to save the Confederacy. As was stated earlier, it was not at all unusual for slaves to be armed. As Marine Lieutenant Henry L. Graves noted about his slave Lawrence in a letter home in late December 1864. He talks about how he would actually fire on the Yankees. But General Lee and even Judah P. Benjamin, the Confederate Secretary of War I, was to make the arming of slaves official policy. But there was also strong opposition to the idea of blacks fighting on the front lines. After all, preserving slavery was one of the reasons the Confederate States had succeeded and gone to war. Get that? After all, this is what they were arguing back and forth, people. This is in their writings. They were arguing back and forth because the people who were refusing it say, look, we were fighting to preserve slavery. If we give these guys weapons and they show themselves to be good soldiers, how can we legitimize, say they're inferior people? That's in their writings. But Robert Breaker won't tell you because he's a liar. What was the point of arming slaves who would surely not serve willingly unless their freedom was the incentive for doing so? And if slaves didn't make courageous soldiers, then the deeply ingrained Southern attitude that they were not capable of anything but hard labor was wrong. It was deeply ingrained Southern attitude. That's what they argued back and forth. He's just reporting, telling you what they were arguing about when this issue came up. Why the Southerners hesitated in arming their slaves. Because the cornerstone of their system was slavery and the inferiority of the black man. You don't believe me? I don't care. Those are the facts. You can find any book to deceive and lie and twist anything you want. But that's the argument came up in 1864 when they had begun to argue about this, and the Confederacy itself was about to be destroyed. And they said, "Look, we're going to have to arm the Confederacy, the slaves." They said, "Wait a minute, the war was being fought for. Let's keep slavery, and now we got to recognize that slavery is going to end, because you can't call them inferior if the guys are fighting as good as we are." Thus, the Confederacy struggled through 1864, relying solely on white fighting forces and using blacks only for manual labor, at least officially. Okay, so unofficially, you might see some pictures of blacks up in the front lines. That's unofficial. They weren't Confederate soldiers before 1864. Okay, so you might see pictures up there that these neo-Confederates put up there. Say, look at, there's a black man with a weapon. There's a black man with a weapon. Yeah, unofficially he's up there with his master, and they were up there. They were just for manual labor and stuff like that. And sometimes they would end up, actually fighting. By early 1865, both sides realized that the war was nearing its end. The situation for the Confederacy was so critical that General Robert E. Lee had become convinced that if slaves were not armed, the cause was lost. He wrote to a Confederate senator on January 11th, "If it ends in subverting slavery, it will be accomplished by ourselves, and we can devise the means of alleviating the evil consequences to both races, I think. Therefore, we must decide whether slavery shall be extinguished by our enemies and the slave be used against us, or use them ourselves at the risk of the effects which may be produced upon our social institutions. We should employ them out today." Right. Lee was against slavery. Yeah, he was against slavery. That's why he wanted to arm the slaves. That's why he wanted to arm the slaves. He wrote to a Confederate senator in January, if it ends in subverting slavery, it will be accomplished by ourselves, and we can devise the means of alleviating the evil consequences to both races. He was also against secession. He didn't think it was legal. I think that, therefore, we must decide whether slavery shall be extinguished by our enemies and the slave be used against us, which they were being used, in Emancipation Proclamation. And the label was being used against them. Of course, free black men were coming in and fighting against them. Or use them ourselves at the risk of the effects that may be produced upon our own social institutions. That's the issue. Now the cornerstone was being taken. It was going to be crumbled. Slavery was going to end. But not because the importation issue. Now it's because the South couldn't fight anymore with just whites. Just over 2 months later, Confederate President Jefferson Davis gave in and signed an order authorizing the enlistment of slaves as soldiers. This Negro soldier law provided the slave soldiers could not be freed except by consent of the owners and of the states in which they may reside. Ironically, in the same month, Congress finally passed the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution prohibiting slavery and all other forms of involuntary servitude. Now, both sides in the war had dealt severe blows to slavery. The South in adopting a policy that would lead to the end of slavery, and the North in actually ending it. The Negro soldier law came too late to be much benefit to the Confederacy. It took time to recruit and organize military regiments. In fact, only a few regiments of slave soldiers have been organized before General Grant ordered an all-out assault on Pittsburgh and Richmond, Virginia. So what is this guy talking about? Half the Confederate army was slaves, blacks. Nutcase. Nuts. They had blacks in these battles, but on the Confederate side, that's why you see pictures up there, but they were there unofficially. They weren't part of the Confederate army. So, let me go here. And he's going to call, let me see what he got. It's 16 minutes.
States profited off of slavery. Many of the ships that went and got slaves and brought them back were northern.
Now he's taxing the American flag by saying the American flag brought in the slaves, which was acknowledged by Lincoln in the second inaugural. He said, both sides are responsible for this war. These guys are so wicked. All you have to read is two inaugurals by Lincoln, where he offered peace to the South and said, I'm not your enemy. Let's not divide over this. I can't touch your slaves by Constitution. I'm not here to overturn anything in the South. I'm here to, I'm going to protect your constitutional rights. And then the second inaugural, he talked about both sides being responsible for the war. And the war was lasting a lot longer than both sides thought it was going to last. Which was, because both sides were responsible for the wickedness of the bloodletting. Then Robert Baker is going to tell you that slavery wasn't too bad. And he's going to lie about that and talk about it. They don't tell you about it. The family separations, the abuse. He wants you to think that sometimes there's some Christian thing. Mostly the little exceptions he looks at where slaves were treated well and they had like a family relationship. Let me tell you something. They were still considered slaves. So if that slave owner died and he was in debt, the family's going to get sold off. The slaves are sold off. And then he's got this thing where he says, oh, the slave owner, if you killed a black man, the white owner could be hung, No baloney. Blacks were not allowed to testify in court. They were allowed to testify in court. And he's talking about the North having 30% more slaves. By 1830, slavery was over in the North. That's a fact. And he talks about the Republicans bringing in the Irish Catholics. The Irish Catholics came in because of the immigration, but they were Democrats. They were not Republicans. They came in and they became Democrats, and they rioted in New York. There was a big riot in New York. You can listen to all this garbage. The lies this guy puts out, and the phony books he puts out, it's just incredible. See, about 24 minutes in here. But
there were laws in the South. South about slavery that if a person was a slave and they had a master who was bad, who was evil, who was mean, who beat them or things like that, the slave could go to the magistrates, to the constable, to the people in charge, and the slave could request a change of master and say, we don't want this person to be our master, we want someone else. And this book goes through and shows you many cases about that, how it was very common that slaves would seek out the most Christian, the most nice, the most loving, caring people. And yes, they would have known who they were because slaves would have talked.
How much do you think the guy could afford them? How much do you think he could afford them? What does that have to do with anything? Frederick Douglass, who escaped slaves, talked about how brutally they were treated. I read a thing from Shelby where they get blacks to beat other blacks. What is he talking about? There's this attempt to cover up history and lie about what slavery was really about, and to create this idyllic image that it really wasn't that bad. And a slave could go to his master, and the white man, and I don't want this slave. I don't want this master. The master would sell you. The master would sell you away. 3 million slaves in the South. And if you didn't do as you told, Frederick Douglass talks about them, they would hire guys to break you.
Talk to other slaves, and then, well, my master is nice. My master did. Well, my master did. And they said, boy, I wish he was my master, kind of thing. And there were many times that slaves would go seek out another master and say, hey, would you purchase me? Because this guy...
And if you have no money, what are you going to do? And you think you're just going to just walk out to a plantation, another plantation, say, hey, can you push me? But again, the idea is that slavery hardened after... The issue was that it was always considered a negative. It was always considered evil until about 1840, when slavery began to be seen as a positive good. And that's what these guys are pushing. That's what it changed, people. It was always seen the idea of the Continental Constitution, we got to end slavery. We got to end slavery. It's an evil. It's a plague on our society. Now these guys, Robert Breaker and his ilk, bring in the idea, it wasn't that bad. Wasn't that bad. So that's, those people trying to escape in the Fugitive Slave Act, they don't, and Southerners going up and pulling these people back, husband and wives being separated, all the things that were going on, the beatings, the hangings, the brandings, all that stuff didn't happen. That's what I want you to believe.
Guy's not very nice to me. And that was very common. Well,
this is the simplistic, childish thinking this guy has.
Stonewall Jackson didn't own any slaves in his life.
He's about Jones Stonewall Jackson. Don't give us Stonewall Jackson. The issue is not a particular Confederacy. The issue is Confederacy. And the fact was, it was very difficult by the time Andrew Jackson, Stonewall Jackson, for a slave to buy his freedom. The states in the South had passed laws forbidding it. Earlier you could. Slaves could buy, that's how you got free blacks in the South. They bought their freedom. But later on, states began hardening on that and denying that. So, let me go here. On a funny note, I used to have to edit it a couple of times, so I'd be up 30 minutes. More.
Going to vote, and they were going to vote to leave the Union because they didn't agree with Lincoln.
They didn't agree with Lincoln being elected. That's why they were seceding before Lincoln got in. This guy doesn't know any history. What sparked the secession wasn't disagreeing with Lincoln, it was the fact that Lincoln got elected. And Lincoln's name wasn't even allowed on the ballot in the South.
Sent in troops, and by bayonet point allowed his troops to vote.
It's about Maryland now. That's throwing the secession. He says, you're not going to secede. That's treason. Yeah, he's upset because Maryland didn't get a chance to become traitors.
in the Maryland, and they voted to keep Maryland part of the Union. Maryland would have said, no, we're leaving.
Maryland wanted the pro-union forces, pro-union people would have won that vote. The Confederates were undermining the vote. He forgets to tell you, when people wanted to stay in the Union, the Confederates basically undermined them. In Texas, that happened, where the guy, I forget the leader, the president of Texas, he wanted to stay in the Union. They didn't want to go. He didn't want to go. Many of these guys, and they attacked the Germans who in Texas were pro-union.
So there were a lot of abuses during the Civil
Sam Houston.
War. But the South was right. They didn't do anything.
The South was right. They doing it. Yeah, they were wrong. They doing it. Yeah. No, they broke the law. And the goal was to enslave, keep in slavery. That was the cornerstone. Read the speech from the Vice President, Stevens. Cornerstone of the South was slavery. This guy yapping, he calls Lincoln a despot and a tyrant in there. Lincoln won a fair election. And the South is violating the Constitution. He wants to compare the South with the British. They had representation. The South had representation. They were overrepresented because of the three-fifths rule, where black was considered 3/5 of a person, which increased, therefore, the white representation in Congress, the South. Those are facts, people. They're facts. But they're facts in context, which this guy would never give you. And all these neo-Confederates never give you. And that's why the theology is fouled up. That's why the theology is fouled up, people. Because he can't separate the concept of a Confederate and the Confederacy. He never told you why in the Confederate Constitution Negro slavery was put in particularly in there to say it can't be forbidden to expand. He never talks about that. They never do. Because that was the issue of the war. Lincoln was elected to stop that expansion. And the idea with 1808, the slave things was well, 1808. The fact is that the blacks were still reproducing. And if you can bring slaves in from Africa, you're cheapening the commodity that the slaves are already in the South. That's why they didn't want African slaves being brought in. It decreased the value of their own slaves. It's because of law of supply and demand. So let's not put this up. I want to shorter. Weather was way too long. I got too heated because this guy is just. But they all believe this garbage. This is simplistic, naive, stupid. And he's going to come out. Let me see if he's get him at the end here. Why does this matter? He writes a blog saying this matters.
A lot of people have compared George Washington to Robert E. Lee. George Washington stayed out on the field for 6 years knowing that he couldn't win.
8 years.
But he knew he had a cause that was righteous and just, and he was going to fight for it. And he won.
He knew he was going to win. He won. Yeah, Lee didn't win. But he couldn't go on anymore. The army was defeated. He met a general that was as good as he was, Grant.
Many say if Robert E. Lee would have done the same thing, he would have won, but he got tired after 4 years and quit.
He got tired. Look at me. Now he's attacking Lee. Now he's attacking his own hero. He didn't get tired and quit. His army was shot. They had no shoes. They hadn't eaten in days. They were beaten. The Union Army was everywhere. The South was cut in half. He's attacking These guys are unbelievable.
If he would have just waited, things could have been different.
Yes, in other words, he says, see, if you just waited for the assassination of Lincoln, see that wouldn't change anything, Robert. That wouldn't change one thing. Nothing was going to stop the war because of assassination. But see that? He's glorifying John Wilkes Booth and attacking Lee.
But I don't want to go more into it. This isn't a fight that I want to fight, because this is.
It is a fight we want to fight. This liar puts up blogs saying why the Civil War still matters, but it's not a fight he wants to fight. These guys never want to fight a fight about when they're wrong, and they're wrong on so many things. It makes your head spin.
50 years ago, and who cares? You know.
You're the one who put in a blog why the Civil War still matters. Now he's saying, who cares? Look at this guy.
But it is worth looking into.
Look at this guy. So, I'll link it to his blog. Who cares? Now he's going to tell you, who cares? Look at the words that come out of this guy's mouth when he wrote a blog, why the Civil War still matters, and he's putting video trying to deceive you. He attacks Lee for getting tired. If you just waited 6 days, his men were starving to death. There was no army left. Compare him to, Washington held for 8 years, and Lee should have held out. He got tired. What? He was hemmed in. They didn't have any outside support. Washington had the French. Learn some history, Robert Breaker. If the French had come in, we would have lost that war. Learn some history. You don't know theology, obviously. And you certainly don't know history. The reason we won that war in Washington because the French came in. If the French fleet hadn't come to Yorktown and defeated the British fleet, we still could have lost that war. They kept the British fleet out. And of course they recognized this early after the Battle of Saratoga, and the French recognized this and got in the war themselves. And that was a big turning point. But the issue at the Yorktown was the French fleet came, blocked the British, defeated them, and then Cornwallis was in the southern campaign, and he kept retreating until he got into Yorktown, and he got blocked in. And the war still continued for a bunch of years after that. Well, King George didn't want to give up, but it was essentially over then. I'll stop with this. You guys take guys seriously. He doesn't know what he's talking about anything. About anything. And you Breaker people want to come up there, and he got at the end here, oh, it doesn't matter, 150. I'm going to link you to his blog. Well, he says, why the Civil War still matters, and why he keeps putting videos up there trying to defend. He attacked Lincoln, he attacks Lee. Boy, if Lee just hadn't been so lazy. If he just waited 6 days, so Booth assassinated, he calls Lincoln a tyrant and a despot. If Lee had, assassinated that Lincoln, who knows, what happened. Yeah, North was just giving up. He calls all the people from North in his little thing on Civil War, spiritual war. That the Yankees were all Universalist Unitarians. Then in the beginning of this video he talks about, the black chaplain came up and the Southern and Northerners would pray together. Wait a minute, I thought you said they were all Universalists. Nothing this guy comes out of his mouth. In a sense, the guy doesn't have the ability to think beyond a fourth grader. He cannot. He's superficial. All these PBI guys are. They're just taught to regurgitate. They're not taught to think. And so he just regurgitates things he reads and picks up here, and he thinks, oh, look at that. And he regurgitates what he does with theology. He doesn't think about anything he says. Just faith works just in the Old Testament. Oh yeah, I proved it. Look at these scriptures. So let me put this up. Amen. Thank you.